Bienvenue à tous. Je suis Jean-Christophe Debar, directeur de Pluriagri. Bienvenue dans ce webinaire consacré au paiement aux agriculteurs pour services environnementaux aux États-Unis. Nous allons voir effectivement quelle est la situation sur ce sujet. Vous allez voir qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qui se passent et qui, je crois, nous interpellent, nous, Français et Européens. Je vous dirai quelques mots sur l'organisation de ce webinaire, mais avant ça, j'aimerais tout de suite passer la parole à Arnaud Rousseau. Arnaud Rousseau est agriculteur et président de Pluriagri. Je précise néanmoins tout de suite, pardon, j'aurais dû le faire d'entrée de jeu, pour l'interprétation. Pour l'interprétation, vous avez une icône en bas de l'écran, interprétation, et vous pouvez cliquer. Ça vous donne accès soit à la langue originale, soit à l'autre langue, français ou anglais. Voilà. Je passe la parole à Arnaud Rousseau, donc président de Pluriagri.
Bien, merci beaucoup Jean-Christophe et bonjour à tous. Alors je voudrais vous dire d'abord la grande joie qui est la mienne de tous vous accueillir. Évidemment accueillir nos invités qui sont sur le continent américain et qui ont accepté de passer cette heure et demie avec nous. Je les en remercie chaleureusement et leur expertise nous sera évidemment précieuse. Je voudrais saluer l'ensemble de ceux qui nous ont rejoints pour ce webinaire et qui de près ou de loin s'intéressent à ce sujet qui évidemment est central dans le moment dans lequel nous sommes. Le récent G20 a remis évidemment sur le devant de la scène les sujets que nous connaissons tous du dérèglement climatique, des sujets de biodiversité. Et dans ce cadre, évidemment, l'agriculture est une réponse, un élément de la solution. Et donc, pour les agriculteurs européens et singulièrement pour les agriculteurs français, se pencher sur la question des services environnementaux, c'est un sujet maintenant que nous travaillons depuis quelques mois ou années et sur lequel nous avons encore des progrès à faire. Et donc, pouvoir comparer cette réflexion avec ce qui se fait aux États-Unis est évidemment extrêmement riche pour nous, dans un moment où peut-être nous attendons de nos interlocuteurs américains qui nous expliquent ce que sont les forces et les faiblesses de leur réflexion. Où en sont-ils d'une certification? Quel est le levier de politique publique qui est utilisé? On a parfois le sentiment en Europe et en France qu'on est encore un peu dans une forme de jungle autour de ces questions du carbone et des paiements pour services environnementaux. Y a-t-il réellement un marché qui est aujourd'hui solide? Est-ce que c'est un marché de gré à gré ou est-ce que c'est un marché plus liquide? Voilà un peu toutes les questions qui se posent. Est-ce qu'on est plutôt dans une approche volontariste ou est-ce que c'est plutôt une approche coercitive qui est employée aux USA? Et in fine, pour l'agriculteur que je suis et pour les agriculteurs, c'est comment, dans cette contribution que nous souhaitons mettre en place, pouvons-nous retirer de la valeur, une fois encore, pour éviter que cette valeur soit faite par d'autres, alors que c'est nous qui sommes à la base de la potentialité de réponse à ces questions. Voilà tout ce que nous allons aborder avec intérêt dans ce webinaire. Donc, merci encore à nos invités et merci à Jean-Christophe, l'organisateur, pour ce moment. Et donc, maintenant, place aux questions, place aux invités. Merci à tous.
Merci Arnaud. Quelques éléments d'abord sur le programme. Donc, nous allons avoir des présentations par 3 intervenants américains que je vous présenterai de manière successive. Malheureusement, le représentant de l'USDA, Sean Babington, a dû annuler à la dernière minute suite à un décès dans sa famille. Nous le regrettons bien sûr, mais avec les intervenants que nous avons, je pense que nous pourrons également parler de politique publique et de quelle manière eux-mêmes, en tant qu'acteurs donc de ces services écosystémiques, conçoivent, quelles réflexions ils ont sur la politique climatique qui est menée actuellement aux États-Unis. Je vous l'ai dit, vous avez donc une icône interprétation qui est en bas de votre écran. N'hésitez pas si vous souhaitez passer du français à l'anglais ou inversement. Et je vous rappelle que pour poser des questions, en revanche, et vous cliquez sur la question, sur l'icône Q&R, toujours en bas de votre écran sur la gauche. Voilà. Donc, 3 interventions de nos intervenants américains. Je leur poserai quelques questions sur la politique fédérale. Et ensuite, un intervenant français que je vous présenterai tout à l'heure interviendra pour justement, un petit peu comme le disait Arnaud, donner un genre de contrepoint, en quelque sorte, français à ce qui a été présenté sur les États-Unis, et puis sera amené probablement à poser quelques questions aux intervenants américains. Voilà. On va commencer tout de suite avec donc notre première intervenante, Debbie Reed, qui est directrice de ESMC. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire ESMC? C'est Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. Et comme son nom l'indique, vous le voyez, il s'agit bien d'une organisation qui travaille sur la création de marchés écosystémiques. Autrement dit, nous attendons de Debbie qu'elle nous dise, qu'elle nous présente ce que fait le secteur privé, peut-être d'ailleurs parfois en alliance avec le gouvernement, avec l'USDA, elle nous dira ça, pour justement créer ces marchés de services écosystémiques, ou marchés environnementaux, services environnementaux concernant le secteur agricole. Donc Debbie, merci. Merci encore d'avoir accepté de participer à ce webinaire. Je vous passe la parole pour 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel to discuss this issue, and really excited to be talking about the implications for what we're doing internationally, given that we really do need to be focusing on this issue globally. I'm going to focus on three topics today. One is an overview of ecosystem service market programs in the US. I have been working in carbon markets and ecosystem service markets since the 1990s, from several positions, first in the Congress, then in the White House, and now from several NGO positions, always focused on agriculture and biological systems. Then I want to talk a little bit about carbon markets and market governance, particularly as it pertains to the United States and how our markets are operating, what kind of oversight there is. And then give an overview of ESMC and our Ecosystem Service Market Research Consortium and how we operate, because we are pretty unique in terms of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So first, we don't have a federal regulatory program for greenhouse gases in the United States. There have been many attempts since the 1990s, starting in 1997 and 1998, in Congress to actually pass bills for cap and trade programs and other regulatory approaches. I believe since the last bill that was passed by the House in 2009, there have been no real attempts at federal regulation. And I think it's highly unlikely that we will have this at a national level, at least in the next 5 years. We could talk about why that is. We do have a regulated carbon program in the state of California. They are unique. They typically tend to be a leader on environmental issues. But again, that's unique in the United States. We do have a lot of private voluntary ecosystem service markets operating, but they tend not to operate in harmony. There is not a harmonized approach, but they're not totally unaligned either. And I will talk about that a little bit when I talk about governance and oversight of programs. Most of the programs that are operating are, in fact, I put credible, do align with standards that help us to ensure fungibility, if you will, of credit. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then in terms of market governance, I'll just say that it is essential, particularly to global fungibility, but also to credibility. And we find with our buyers in particular, they are eager to understand the provenance of all credits and ensure that if they purchase credits, they can say that the credits are verified, they're validated, that they don't want to be accused of greenwashing, of green wishing, et cetera. And there is a lot of concern from the private sector about that issue in particular. There are multiple carbon offset registries, if we talk just about carbon markets, that operate in the United States. Several of them operate globally. At least one operates only in the United States. And the California Air Resources Board, which is the regulator of their carbon market, operates only in California. The thing I'll say about this is that these, since the 90s, and I put the dates that each of these organizations started, have been operating in the voluntary carbon offset market space. Gold Standard and Vera, two of these registries, also have been moving into how you quantify UN SDGs for the private sector in particular. And with the Gold Standard also have been focusing also on supply chain reporting, which is scope 3 reporting in the agricultural sector and in other sectors. And they are the organization that we have been working with. But typically in terms of governance and who is providing oversight to carbon markets, it is these registries operating in the United States. In terms of the issue of credibility, fungibility that I referenced, I think we all agree there need to be rules. Most of what happens in this country tends to follow what I call the global standards and enabling bodies. There are accounting standards. There are target setting standards. Our companies, for instance, most of them have target setting under SBTI, which is a Science-Based Targets Initiative, and increasingly under SBTN, which is the Science-Based Target Network. There are reporting standards. I referenced already the carbon registries. And there are enabling bodies. Now what we're seeing globally, and you've probably seen this as well, there are integrity and oversight bodies really focused on the issue of if we globally are going to put our resources into carbon markets, we need additional oversight and to ensure the integrity of these resources. That is fairly new. Again, most of what we've seen in the past has been through these global registries. I think that's all good news in terms of what's happening. I just like this to show this slide to make sure everyone is aware. Carbon markets, which began in the 1990s in this country, really operate within scope 1, right? Helping companies really report on their direct greenhouse gas emissions. We have very functioning and functional renewable energy and low carbon fuel standard markets operating in the United States and globally. Where our organization is active is in a market program for scope 3 actors. So that is supply chain actors who have agriculture as part of their supply chain. So our buyers are largely food and beverage companies who have made commitments to reduce their supply chain as well as scope 1 and scope 2 emission reductions. And we're really the first market program operating in that context in the United States. That is one thing that does make us different. And we recently were accredited by Gold Standard and Sustained Cert in terms of our operations and our the credits that we generate for scope 3. One thing I'd like to note is I do think, and we talked about this a little bit before the webinar started, we still do need a global accounting ledger. And I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot of activity underway under Article 6 under the Framework Convention, but we need a global ledger so that not just carbon offset markets, but markets like ours that operate in scope 3 can really track what is happening and ensure that there is no double counting, or when it is appropriate in supply chain accounting, that it is being followed. I think that is where voluntary private market programs and government programs come together, is in some sort of global ledger or linked ledgers that are operating together. An example of how it would work for the United States is in our market program for supply chain reporting. The US can claim everything our companies are claiming as part of their nationally determined commitment. And that is not viewed as bad double counting, right? Because we're not operating in an offset market. The question remains, how do you do that? And how do you ensure that they are being credibly tracked? There is no way right now for companies, including my organization, to report to USDA or to the federal government what we are doing. So they can make those claims in their NDC, but there's no way set up to do that. Now I'll talk a little bit about ESMC and how we operate. We are a nonprofit and we're mission driven and impact driven, and we really created for a couple of reasons. One is, after operating in carbon markets for many years, it was clear that biological systems are different, agricultural systems are different, They're incredibly important to functioning global markets, but we need to really tailor rules so that they're operating for agricultural systems. And the other thing is that we shouldn't just focus on carbon. We should also be focusing on water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, and other impacts that any changes in agricultural systems have. So our market design is actually created so that we generate multiple credits. Again, all of these are for Scope 3 supply chain reporting. We generate improved soil carbon credits, reduced greenhouse gas credits, water quality, water use conservation or water quantity credits, and then biodiversity credits for corporates to claim in their Scope 3. Before we developed our program, we did a national analysis. This was in 2018, and we determined at that time that companies who did have commitments for supply chain reporting had a $13.9 billion demand for just carbon and water quality credits. That has only increased since then, and we have seen demand continue to go up. Another thing about us is that we're not just a market program. We also have a research program that is really focusing on how do we better quantify, how do we digitize quantification of all of the outcomes that we are tracking, and do it at a national scale cost effectively so that no one company has to do that. So we have a market program that did launch in May of this year after 4 years of development, and we will continue to operate our research program alongside that. This slide just shows the members in our program who are not just buyers, but actors across the entire agricultural supply chain. That's another thing we had seen in the past, is that the development of markets and the rules and the protocols had been done without agricultural actors at the table. And that meant that there was often a misfire, that protocols didn't work for farmers and ranchers. So everything we have done with these partners in our pilot projects before we move them into a market program. The other thing I'll say is that we are a public-private partnership. So we do operate with federal agencies who are in our governance structure. And on the upper right here, what you see is that the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, their Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency are all part of our governance structure on the research side. So they help weigh in on everything that we're doing to ensure that we are all acting in concert in our research program and building resources that benefit both the public and the private sector. I've talked probably enough about how we operate, but the important point here is that we are creating this national infrastructure that is digitizing all of the quantification and the verification approach so that we can do this cost effectively at scale. And again, so that no one company has to make these investments themselves. That is something we really work to overcome because it has been a problem in the past. The other thing is that we can, by virtue of this system, track impacts at multiple scales: field, farm, watershed, region, all the way up to the national scale, so that we can figure out what actions on the ground are in fact leading to improved soil carbon or reduced greenhouse gases or improved biodiversity at these multiple scales over time. I think one important point to ask, who are our buyers? I alluded to this. They are food and beverage companies who have made commitments. Most of them have SBTI commitments, which means they are adhering to the analogous country commitment, if you will, to the Paris Agreement, right? To keep their emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And our program is intended to help them meet those goals and commitments. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but really, if you look at the food and beverage sector globally, they have committed to reduce their agricultural and land-based emissions 85% by 2050, which is a significant uptake that needs to happen in terms of what needs to happen on the ground, right, with farmers and ranchers, but also the ability to quantify and track that for these companies to meet their commitments. And as you see at the bottom, that's really looking at, from this report, $55 trillion in assets where companies are really focused on their ability to meet these commitments. The last thing that I'll point out here is these are the standards that we adhere to in our program. So I alluded to SBTI and SBTN, which are typically target setting commitments that our companies make. In terms of accounting and reporting, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that companies use, but also countries use to develop their greenhouse gas inventories and their emission reduction commitments. And all of our protocols do adhere to ISO, International Standard Organization standards for agriculture. And then we use Gold Standard and Sustain Cert as our third-party independent verifiers. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Debbie, pour cette présentation qui montre beaucoup de choses et je suis certain que ça va susciter beaucoup de questions, mais clairement, on voit à vous entendre que le secteur agricole, alimentaire aux États-Unis considère la question du climat comme quelque chose de sérieux. Et ils font beaucoup d'efforts, ou ils ont l'intention en tout cas de travailler à la réduction de leurs émissions de gaz à effet de serre pour atteindre certains objectifs dont vous disiez qu'ils devaient être en ligne avec ce que souhaiterait atteindre l'accord de Paris. Beaucoup de questions qu'on prendra à la suite. Néanmoins, pour une précision tout de suite, ce que vous nous présentez, d'ailleurs vous avez commencé par ça, Debbie, finalement en disant que beaucoup de ces actions sont de l'ordre du volontariat. Les entreprises ont certes saisi l'importance de l'enjeu, mais on est au stade des actions volontaires. Il y a peu de coercition, en quelque sorte, pour reprendre le mot d'Arnaud Rousseau tout à l'heure. Une question à ce sujet, au sujet d'un projet, si je ne me trompe, de l'autorité de la bourse américaine, qui a un projet qui obligerait les grandes entreprises cotées en bourse à déclarer leurs émissions de gaz à effet de serre et à présenter un plan de réduction de ces émissions. Est-ce que c'est bien ça? Ce plan, il en est où? C'est pas encore acté, c'est un projet, c'est ça?
Yes, I think you're asking about the U.S. Securities and Exchange
Yes.
Commission.
Oui.
Yes, they have released draft guidance and they've asked for comments on their guidance that would require companies to report their financial risk associated with climate change. And any company that has made commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to report Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventories. The guidance is anticipated, I think, mid to early next year at this point, but the draft, it looks like they will require Scope 1 and Scope 2 reporting. Scope 3 is kind of on the back burner and will be a work in development for a host of reasons. But I will say they did receive a lot of comments. It's been taking them a long time to get through all of the comments. And with the political climate divided, if you will, between those who feel that companies should act and those who feel they should not act, I think there's been concern about how far they push with it, but they will be coming out with that guidance next year.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons passer à notre interlocuteur suivant. Merci, Debbie. Nous allons revenir vers vous avec les séances de questions. Chris Arbourt. Chris est directeur de la stratégie à Indigo. Indigo, bien sûr, Chris, vous allez nous en parler, mais on peut dire tout de suite que c'est un des principaux, en français, je dirais peut-être agrégateurs de crédit carbone aux États-Unis, mais Indigo travaille également en Europe. Donc, on a vu avec Debbie qu'il y a vraiment une approche sur les services écosystémiques très large, puisque c'est non seulement le carbone, stockage de carbone ou les émissions de gaz à effet de serre qui sont visées, mais également la biodiversité, également la qualité, les quantités d'eau. Avec Indigo, on est vraiment bon sur les marchés volontaires du carbone. Donc, Chris, je vous passe la parole pour, bien sûr, nous présenter ce que vous faites à Indigo, et puis pour nous dire, à votre avis, quels sont les principaux défis que les entreprises comme la vôtre, ou généralement le secteur agricole américain, doit relever pour faire en sorte que les marchés du carbone connaissent ce succès, disons. Chris, c'est à vous.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, and good afternoon. I think I want to really focus in on, and what I was asked to talk about is a little of the experiences in the U.S. related to farmers and agriculture in particular, maybe what translates to French growers. And we've had some operations and experiences in the EU as well. Wanted to kind of talk through some high-level principles of what we're operating on today, and a little of what we've accomplished, and hopefully some lessons here that can be helpful in thinking. One of the keys for us is the high quality nature of a carbon credit. And when we talk about the U.S. context, we started here in the U.S., but the standards and the concepts of soil carbon sequestration, which translates over to the Scope 3 world as well, that really is a global approach. It's a scientifically rigorous approach that works in any country, really, with any soil. It's reliant on a number of academic publications and a deep and rich history of publication in order to drive the confidence in the output. After all, it is the abatement and removal or sequestration of an invisible gas, expressed as carbon dioxide, but is really a mixture of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and changes in soil carbon storage, all expressed as either tons of sequestered carbon in the case of a carbon credit. Carbon credits actually are a simplification, right? It's a first market entry position of what's possible. And we chose to start with the concept of carbon credits in the US because there was a standard for it. There was an understood market, and pricing could be attached. And that's sort of important for us. Now, the pricing, the value of the carbon credit is really related to the four concepts here on the blue circles. First one is realness. And realness is really what all of us in this industry provide, is the backbone, the rigorous recording of information about how the farmer has farmed, both in their baseline, the historic 4 years, and then the year in which a change has occurred, and tracking that into the future for some of these others, right? So that first thing that you do in that first year in a program is additionality. Something had to change from the primary activity. So this sort of highlights the major challenge in agriculture for a farmer, is that we're asking them to make a change on their land, something that they were not accustomed to doing, they now have to do and continue to do. And in exchange for that, we're coming up with a financing vehicle. There's another group, another company willing to pay them for that behavior change. And we think that's roughly worth half of the value of a carbon credit in the market, so to speak. So that additionality piece, what you do in that first year as a farmer, is roughly half. Then the other half of the value is that it stays that way, that it's not re-released to the atmosphere or recycled in the following year or in a following crop rotation over a period of time. And that's this concept of permanence. Now, in the Scope 3 world, when we're thinking about supply chains, permanence has been substituted for another word, and I hope the translation is okay, perpetuity. Both are fabulously difficult terms to quantify and understand. We think of it as durability, and durability in behavior. If we go back to that example of it being behavior change, it's about a new practice being adopted and that practice sticking. So both additionality and permanence are the key value drivers in this. And leakage is just really a call out of a broader element of the particular criteria of a carbon market, that we do no harm. that ultimately the program is the best outlook, that you're not inadvertently doing something quite well on the acreage that's part of your program, the land that's part of your program, but it's displacing that outcome from that field, agricultural outcome in terms of bushels of grain or of volume of a commodity coming off of the field. And leakage is a term that kind of covers the inadvertent change somewhere else as a result of a better behavior potentially in one area. So it's looking at those unintended consequences. And I think for me serves as a bucket or a reminder to us all that we have to be thinking about not just our programs, but what the unintended consequences of those potential changes are. And we see this kind of dramatic movement in the US market for sure around biofuels, sustainable aviation fuel, biodiesel, ethanol that now is converted. Ethanol is a substitution for gasoline. It's also an industrial precursor for many industrial processes. It's also now being converted into short chain chemistries, being converted into long chain chemistries for diesel and for aviation fuel as well. We're seeing a lot of that happen. The key to all of it, and really the value for a farmer in a program like what Indigo is bringing forward, is a place to record and understand and work with your data so that you know what you're doing. It's a data harvest in parallel to a traditional growing harvest. And then it's also the opportunity to then position that into the market as a new revenue stream. And some of those revenue streams are within the existing supply chain, those partners who are already buying the primary crop that the grower is producing from that acre. We have programs for that. And then there are other programs for those areas where either no one's interested or the dollars are potentially better. This is all economically driven. The dollars are better for, say, an offset credit to be produced and for an airline or a tech company or someone else to become a new customer of that farmer. Okay. I'm having trouble going to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Great. We had a proof point in this past year. These have been hypothetical discussions for the industry until June of 2022, where we issued through Climate Action Reserve the first registry approved credits at scale, 19,000 credits across several 100,000 acres of farmers who submitted all of the rigorous background, independent external audits, and then ultimately credits through the Climate Action Reserve that posted in June. We had buyers of those credits lined up, and we had financing terms already worked out with the growers. Our general rule of thumb on these programs is that 75% of the value of the carbon credit goes directly to the farmer. We cover all of the costs of the soil sampling, that's a portion, the biogeochemical modeling, the audits, all of the checks, and the relationships we have with partners, those agricultural businesses that are working with farmers currently, that all is out of the remaining 25%. So we're adamant that is a key piece. The farmer's doing the majority of the work. They're incurring the cost and the risk. The majority of the benefit should go to them as well. But the important thing to remember there in that percentage split, 75% going to a farmer and 25% to Indigo and its partners, it drives alignment, economic alignment. We really don't need a governing body or a government oversight in some way saying that this is how it's going to be and this is the portion. We're aligned with a farmer. So a farmer knows going into a program with us that they are on the same side of the table, so to speak, as an analogy, where we are in a negotiation with a buyer of this asset, and it's in our interest as Indigo and the interest of the farmer to maximize that opportunity. So we're looking at economic sustainability as well as environmental sustainability through these programs. I just wanted to highlight, and Debbie spoke a little bit about some of these. I wanted to highlight some changes and some interesting things that really, where we started in carbon credits, makes perfect sense as you expand that to other supply chain partners looking to repackage that information into a different way and attach it to the primary commodity. It was a recent publication of a greenhouse gas protocol from WRI. It's a draft, it's in comment period right now, but it allows for, and the science-based targets sort of follow that greenhouse gas protocol in the language. These two documents in consort allow removal to be part of the Scope 3 accounting. So I think this opens up more opportunity for farmers, but it also opens up the challenging word that I used before, perpetuity, and the requirement that if you are in your Scope 3, not just looking at abatement, which historically has been the piece. An abatement might be a good example of using less nitrogen fertilizer on an acre. You used less, you accounted for it, you document it, it's audited, that happened. There's no trailing chance for that to be undone. You used less. In a removal ton, it means that you're actually pulling in the analog of a carbon credit, you're pulling that over into the ground, for example. That's the storage as a change in soil organic carbon. But now the brand is tied to a perpetuity concept of having to make sure that that is not reversed in a very similar way to a carbon credit. So I think starting in carbon credits for us really paved the way for the rigor and the systems necessary to handle some of what I might say are equally as rigorous, but packaged differently around the greenhouse gas protocol and the whole Scope 3 world. So exciting to see that. Lots of changes coming, lots of groups kind of involved in this from the beginning. As I'm saying here, there's a number of targets that were set, SBTI targets that were set, that are now going to have to rapidly move. So there's a movement here that we're seeing, and an urgency within brands to address this, to think through it. What I'm making sure they all realize is that these guidance documents that were put together are not far-fetched. They're not overreaching. They're achievable. And we've proven it. We've proven it with carbon programs. We've also proven it with some of the pilot programs we have in this scope with brands. Okay. And the last slide I have here, and then I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and conversation here as well. The concept of thinking about this again from a grower perspective is, how do I approach a farmer who has a small business? They're a small business operator. This is something new to them. They have not produced this type of asset before on their farm. How do I talk to them about it? How do I make sure they know that this choice is a long-term choice? We're talking about long-term programs, long-term commitments. How do we make sure and assure them that they're making the right choice and that they're in a program that preserves their flexibility into the future? Our carbon program is a great start. It's applicable to any acres. Any acre that can be part of our program is eligible to create a carbon credit if they do the additionality and the realness and stick with it along the program guidance and are good participants in our program. But in another year, there may be an opportunity for Market Plus, or on different acres that they have different fields. There may be an opportunity for Market Plus, which is our offering for the Scope 3 world, and thinking about those programs. So we're working with Anheuser-Busch, Nestle, Walmart, and a few others on programs to look at different elements of their supply chain, document those, and think about how they're addressing their Scope 3 requirements of where they're headed in their overall accounting. Okay. I think it's important to highlight the aligned economics. It's a piece when we think, and we've of course have a European operation, and we've talked to farmers in France as well. And there's the Label Basse Carbone program right now that was considered in many ways. It's very interesting. It's a national approach, and then it's an even participation back. I think the difference in what we've done with the U.S. is it's more performance-based, where the particular benefit on a field is realized by that farmer who does a little bit extra. And we've really focused on that individual performance, that if you put in more effort, you're likely to get more output. And we encourage that. Not only does it drive up the total amount being produced, we're participating in that, but we also think it drives closer to a regenerative agriculture future that brings along all the co-benefits that we all know are there from the suite of practices that qualify as additionality, or that drive the correct kind of reduction in supply chain emissions overall. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Chris, pour cette présentation. Nous allons prendre, bien sûr, une série de questions. Je vous en poserai juste une seule. Vous avez annoncé, vous avez indiqué plutôt qu'en juin dernier, Indigo a libéré en quelque sorte un certain nombre de crédits, 19 000, je crois. Pour quelle valeur? Plus précisément, finalement, quel est le montant qu'a reçu ou qu'ont reçu les agriculteurs en moyenne sur cette quantité de crédit carbone?
Jean-Christophe, I'm not hearing a translation. I'm not sure if it was a
OK.
question.
Quel a été, je vais parler peut-être un peu plus lentement, quel a été le prix payé aux agriculteurs pour les crédits carbone que vous avez annoncés au mois de juin dernier?
No, again, I'm not hearing it. And maybe I'll just try to answer, on
Okay,
the journey.
I will ask you in English then.
Sure.
What's the price paid to the farmers for the
Absolutely.
19,000 credits that you've announced in last June?
Yes. So our average prices overall, we were working with many buyers. When we started 2 years ago, the pricing was $20 per metric ton of carbon. We raised the prices with our partners to $27, and then we raised them to $40. So in that first cohort, it was a blended average of those different sales that we did. Growers were in that cohort paid $30 per ton for the carbon. So kind of market leading pricing, very exciting for them, and actually well above the cost of the changes that they were asked to make in many cases too.
Merci. Nous aurons l'occasion, je pense, de revenir sur ces quelques chiffres. Notre intervenant suivant, Christophe Jospe. Merci encore, Chris. Christophe, alors, quand on a discuté avec Christophe de sa présentation, de la manière dont il pourrait rendre compte de son expérience sur le marché du carbone aux États-Unis, Christophe m'a dit qu'il était devenu un petit peu sceptique, qu'il se posait un certain nombre de questions sur le futur de ces marchés, sur la capacité de ces marchés à réellement entraîner une décarbonation du secteur agricole ou de l'économie en général. Il nous a semblé intéressant, effectivement, de pouvoir, avec vous, Christophe, voir exactement pourquoi vous posez ces questions. Et je rappellerai, pour illustrer peut-être justement ces questions que vous posez, que il y a quelques années de ça, vous avez été cofondateur de Nori, qui est un autre gros agrégateur de crédit carbone américain, donc cofondateur de Nori, que vous avez quitté il y a à peu près 1 an et demi, 2 ans, je crois, pensant qu'il y avait peut-être d'autres choses à faire, et vous avez fondé une compagnie qui s'appelle Carbon A-List, Carbone A-List en français, qui continue à travailler de manière très active pour aider à la décarbonation de l'agriculture dans le secteur agricole, agroalimentaire en particulier. Voilà. Donc, Christophe, merci d'être avec nous, et je vous passe la parole tout de suite.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe and Pluriagri for putting this together. And it's a real pleasure and honor to speak with all of you and share the stage with my colleagues, Debbie and Chris. I will share my screen.
En fait, il entendait.
Okay, is that working? So, as Jean-Christophe said, I perhaps disappointed him when he wanted one view, and I said, well, in fact, I think there's a deeper and more interesting conversation to have currently that I try to capture in my title. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but don't use a square peg for a round hole. And in that sense, as Chris alluded to, and both Debbie, what we're effectively talking about are financial incentives or market mechanisms, and carbon markets being one potential market mechanism. And I'd like to present a view where we can think about them a little more critically and still see their benefit to hopefully serve a common purpose that we all care about and need, which is to really reverse the trajectory of the emissions to live on a more sustainable planet. So the next 15 minutes, I'll share my personal story around Nori, why I left, where carbon markets fall short, which are both challenges to improve them and some opportunities, and then some general advice for producers who are considering carbon markets in the spirit of improving them and hopefully finding a best possible solution. So it feels special to be on the stage with both Debbie and Indigo, because in 2017, I was attending the SEAG conference, which Debbie had been hosting for quite a few years. And I actually met my current business partner, Nick Gazer, at that conference. So thank you, Debbie. And thank you to Indigo for the time while I was at Nori, for your close perceived collaboration with us, where we sort of opened the books to how we were working with soil metrics and Comet Farm, and your eventual purchase of that tool, which led to, I think, more use or more harmonization of a USDA tool. So my Nori story. Co-founded the company in 2017. In fact, you could say Carbon A-List launched Nori in 2017 because I started Carbon A-List in 2016, although I put it on pause to go full-time into Nori. And as an outsider and startup, we didn't exactly color within the lines. We looked at the registries and said, there are ways as entrepreneurs that we can make progress more quickly while still meet the spirit of the International Organization Standardization Guidance on Greenhouse Gas Accounting. And since then, I think it, although maybe wasn't used, was at least informing other synergistic efforts that were looking for software-based approaches to ultimately establish digital baselines through agriculture in new ways. And of course, baselines are important because that is effectively the moneymaker for carbon markets. One compares one baseline against another, and the delta of which it creates the credit. And so through an integration with Comet Farm, we were able to take a USDA approved tool, a tool that was compliant with reporting on the national inventory level for the United States, and a tool that's also scenario generating, which is critical for carbon markets because it answers the question to the producer, if I make this intervention, here's what I might expect to change. However, as I continued at Nori and listened to farmers who really questioned this market and questioned how might this help me, and then questioned a deeper system level, is this actually creating the positive change? Or is this maybe just working for companies who present the perception of positive change? I realized it wasn't just Nori, but actually the industry at large that needed a bit more soul searching, including myself. So I stepped away, and if you Google a article, "Do it, prove it, sell it, my evolving views on carbon accounting," I go into detail more onto why I left and why I took the approach to swim further upstream. And to swim further upstream, it's not to say carbon markets are bad. Rather, the things that carbon markets are requiring are quite relevant to a number of applications that can drive change. So on this next slide, when you think about do it, prove it, sell it, do it is the largest bucket of what all farmers should be considering. And it, if you abstract it away, is in terms of tons of CO2 equivalents that's avoided or removed. One might make a change that's not driven necessarily by a market mechanism, but it's driven through need for return on investment or having access to technology to actually know what to do. The data intelligence that informs the actual doing can result in critical greenhouse gas reductions that don't necessarily need to be sold and often provide greater flexibility to farmers. Similarly, financing opportunities, whether through grants, through loans, through certain insurance mechanisms, through certain quantification of inclusion for ecosystem service value as connected to a crop, can be similar drivers for doing it. To think about grape producers, for instance, if you are selling a grape at a higher price because you have a higher ecosystem service value, that in itself may far outpace what you might even get through a credit. Doing it can be informed by policy, and I think this is a really interesting discussion that we can get into more. It may or may not require audits, and it certainly requires the education, which I think is a common thread across the board of what do we need to do and how can we do it? And that's where, as an entrepreneur, I really applaud many of the efforts that I think can teach us a lot, but recognize we as a world need to be thinking, how can we best be prepared to know what to do in which context? When talking around proving it and selling it, this flows into some of the other market mechanisms that both Chris and Debbie have alluded to in terms of supply chain reporting. In this next slide, though, I want to just point out that there's actually multiple market mechanisms that drive doing it. And one of the attractions to carbon markets is it answers this question that if we take money on one side and see it as connecting to an environmental intervention, that it would be able to answer the outcome driven from that financial influx. However, in fact, when looking at agriculture, this is a non-comprehensive list of quite a few assets that can be derived from the doing it and similar data structures that are required or looking at carbon markets. In some cases, real estate, which shows significant evidence in farmland, can become higher value just by the nature of increasing your soil health. The science and research, the environmental interventions, the return on investment, all of these are similar assets. And the thesis of Carbon A-List, which sort of found a new life since 2021, and we're now a 10-person team working across quite a few companies in both the farmer organization, the startup space landscape, and large consumer packaged goods companies, is we navigate through many of these assets thinking around the data structures required by carbon markets, but have relevance to many other activities. I want to talk a little bit about how market options vary because there is interest in the voluntary versus compliant space. And I think it's important to recognize who is driving it and where might all this be headed. It's important to recognize that, of course, the voluntary space is being driven by corporates who have a need to meet their net zero emissions. It's being driven by supply chain efforts to find activities to reduce those greenhouse gases in their supply chain. It's driven by consumers who, whether through labels or things like bas carbone, would be seeking these activities to flow up. But it has variable requirements and variable credibility. I agree with Debbie's comments that we're seeing greater harmonization, but we're also seeing significant differences. And in fact, a few silos being emerging, which lead to a reduction of trust or credibility. And so efforts that can kind of open up how the end-to-end processes or life cycles might work for various programs are really useful. On the compliance side, this is regulated. Indeed, the California Air Resources Board is the best example to look to in the United States for agriculture. The protocol requirements are far more consistent, are able to point to common databases that can be applied in order to determine the greenhouse gas estimates. The verification requirements are far more consistent. The variable scale, there is a variable scale on compliance. We're looking at much larger farms, but it provides a few more options for mitigation. Just to highlight that not all voluntary options are the same, and to kind of begin thinking about where are some of the terms. The first piece is around eligibility terms and conditions. Who is eligible to enroll in which program may vary depending on whether you're considering a Scope 3 reporting insetting like program or an offsetting program. Of course, on the offsetting program, it would effectively look to someone to adopt a new practice or a net new practice. And there's actually quite a few enrollment pathways that are still being uncovered. The price, of course, varies, and how that price is calculated or determined, and again, going through the baseline, is still unclear and kind of murky. But who has the right to claim what, I think, is a very important question to consider, because it's kind of the essence of carbon insetting or offsetting markets. The idea of supply chain reporting is that you're effectively creating an asset that a company might be looking to either offset their own emissions or use to report progress against their stated goals. And by creating a digital asset or representation of these things, it's easy, potentially, to translate that in a clear way, but that, again, is not harmonized. Similarly, on the quantification approaches or the measurement approaches, different markets have different ways of doing things. And this is where some of the murkiness emerges. And it's important to recognize that the quantification approaches that might work well for broadacre farms in the United States may be less applicable to smaller farms that have more diverse crop rotations or are in different regions. And generally, the registries have existed to support methodologies that support a suite of quantification approaches. And yet, to my comments on a square peg in a round hole, we're seeing some kind of quickly evolving mechanisms that might apply remote sensing or combinations of machine learning in concert with direct measurement or process-based models, all of which ultimately determine how much one might expect to accrue over time in a carbon market. These things must be dynamic, as we can certainly expect in the next decade, there will be significant improvements in some of these approaches. On the right, you can see that there aren't actually that many agriculture-based carbon credits relative to all of the different voluntary carbon market options. But we do have at least 6 types of different methodologies across 7 standards, currently in 8 countries. So to disappoint a bit and perhaps share a different perspective that the United States is game time ready for carbon markets, I wanted to cite a recent article that came out from Trust in Food, which is part of the Farm Journal, entitled "Ready or Not, Ag Carbon Markets and US Farmers." And the pie graph on the bottom here demonstrates that actually 97% of farmers are not ready to participate in carbon markets without significant changes. And on the upper right, we look at what are the things that they would like to see. And would they be willing to get credits for pre-existing practices? Seems very important to quite a few farmers. Now, what does this mean in terms of square peg to round hole? It means for offsets as a financing mechanism that said, would this have occurred if not but for the payment? When surveying farmers, they're saying, well, I want a payment for the good work that I've done. Now, that in fact is a different market mechanism than one that is saying, I am selling this to a company who wants to ensure that their payment is creating net new practices. And yet the same data infrastructure and the same integrated enrollment platforms being developed by my colleagues could supply evidence to support this type of financial flow, which I think is worth considering, at least at this time. So just to leave with some quick advice. Technology access is critical. And when I mean technology, I don't just mean software. I mean on-farm technology, and also knowing how to apply and where to apply this technology. Not limiting the system to any one pathway, similarly, is critical. And what that means is the farmers who are participating in these programs should think about it where if that program were to disappear tomorrow, would they still be able to be successful? Would they have set themselves up for success? And what that boils down to is understanding your data. Understanding part of this involves participating in an audit trail. And part of that means that if someone's to question any of the activities that you did, that you would be able to supply that evidence. Linking the data to support carbon measurement to farm business decisions is a critical piece to all of this, in my view, to actually make these carbon markets stickier. When you're just supplying data and it's running through a algorithm that is spitting out estimates that ultimately reward you, that's not linked to the practical decisions you are making, it not only reduces trust, it reduces relevance to the producers. And when you're able to say, understanding that my carbon, or for that fact matter, water, or actually more integrated biodiversity, is relevant to decisions I'm making on a day-to-day basis, then the pathway for data will help the farmers realize that this is linked, and this isn't some audit program to just get their check, but it's linked to being more resilient and leading to a more profitable farm, aligned with reducing their carbon emissions. And the key question here is practicality. When food companies show up to consortia and large standards bodies create standards, farmers typically have not been invited to the table to provide their input, and often are saying, well, I'm just going to take this program and accept it. Or I'm not going to be part of this program because no one asked me to be part of this program. And I think to those who are on the call, there's an amazing opportunity to find leadership positions and insert themselves into public commenting periods to make sure that their voices are heard, and to make sure that this is really grounded in practicality and not a market design. And I'll just put up, I won't read all of these questions, but these are important terms to consider to recognize what we're talking about is a system of rules that is not always as straightforward. And typically, when we're looking at people ensuring that there's backed by a claim, in the United States at least, it's worth recognizing almost half of the land that's farmed is rented, is leased. And so who has the right to claim what or collect what type of payment? In some cases, it's cash rent arrangements where a farmer may not be farming that land next year, and yet they might be expected to do certain activities. One of the main barriers right now for farmers not enrolling in carbon offset programs or voluntary soil health programs is there's actually a real concern that if I improve the health of the soil, that my rent will go up and the landlord will start charging me more. And so understanding some of these questions around who is being contracted with, who is benefiting from this program, understanding what are the terms of the financing. And maybe we'll just leave it at that to keep on time, but I very much look forward to the discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Christophe. Alors, on a une approche effectivement un petit peu différente, mais il sera bien sûr intéressant de voir les réactions, les commentaires que ça soulève, que ça suscite de la part de Debbie et de Chris. Je retiens quand même une partie du titre de votre présentation, Christophe, ne pas jeter le bébé avec l'eau du bain. Il me semble que beaucoup de vos commentaires, de vos critiques visent précisément à améliorer le fonctionnement des marchés et non pas à dire qu'ils ne servent à rien. Mais on va revenir là-dessus, sur ces questions-là. Avant ça, notre dernier intervenant, alors, Avant notre dernier intervenant, une question aux trois représentants américains ici présents. Malheureusement, comme je le disais, donc Sean Babington, représentant de l'USDA, ne peut pas être avec nous ce soir. J'aimerais vous poser une question précise au sujet d'une initiative majeure que l'USDA, donc le département américain de l'agriculture, a annoncée au mois de septembre dernier. Cette initiative s'appelle Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. Et à l'occasion de cette initiative, l'USDA va financer à peu près jusqu'à hauteur globalement d'à peu près 3 milliards de dollars, peut-être même un petit peu plus, puisqu'il y a une première tranche qui a été annoncée et on attend encore une deuxième tranche, mais grosso modo, on sera entre 3 et 3 milliards et demi de dollars. Qui en fait vont accompagner un certain nombre d'actions. Quelles actions? Des projets qui ont été sélectionnés précisément suite à l'appel d'offres que l'USDA avait lancé. Ces projets, globalement, et le soutien donc de l'USDA va en fait dans trois grandes directions. D'une part, inciter les agriculteurs, les producteurs agricoles à adopter des pratiques plus favorables au climat de manière générale. Deuxièmement, à soutenir les actions qui vont dans le sens de mieux mesurer, de mieux quantifier les réductions de gaz à effet de serre et de stockage de carbone. Et puis troisièmement, toujours selon l'USDA, soutien à des actions qui visent à développer des marchés de produits agricoles ou alimentaires répondant précisément à certaines exigences environnementales et plus précisément climatiques. Donc l'USDA finance pratiquement 70 projets, je crois. C'est ce qui a été annoncé au mois de septembre et je crois comprendre que dans les trois intervenants qui sont avec nous ce soir, voilà, certains d'entre vous, peut-être les trois, je ne sais pas, vous allez nous le dire, vous avez répondu à cet appel d'offres de l'USDA et vous en récoltez, si je puis dire, quelque chose. Donc, peut-être on va commencer avec Debbie, vous-même. Alors, Debbie, qu'est-ce que ESMC tire de la participation, parce que je crois, hein, c'est bien le cas, de Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities?
Thank you. So we are actually part of 5 awards that were made, and they are in various cropping and livestock systems, including grassland, grazing land, pasture land, beef production systems, as well as dairy and then other cropping systems. None of the awards has actually been executed to date. We actually had a call yesterday with the USDA. They anticipate they'll be executed by March of next year. But our role in all of the projects we are engaged in is to use our accredited, what I call our monitoring, reporting, and verification system to quantify outcomes and to then sell them to buyers in Scope 3 supply chain reporting. All of them include carbon. Some of them also include water, and some of them will be testing biodiversity as well as part of those projects. So we're very excited about it. We're excited about the infusion of funds. And I will say there's a lot of questions still as to how all of these projects will come together and contribute to USDA's, what I will say, national approach to quantification and reporting what is happening on the ground.
Merci, Debbie. Chris, I don't know if you've heard my question.
Yes, I was.
Okay,
yeah, I'm good.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the climate smart commodities granting process, we were involved in a number of them. We're part of one that was successful. It's with American Farmland Trust. We were in a support role in all of them. We made a conscious choice not to lead. What I'm really excited about overall, when we think about the infrastructure and the use of taxpayer dollars in the US for other industries, we think of weather radar, for example, activating the Weather Channel and other forms of media. There are the air traffic control system that helps airlines actually be remotely profitable. In terms of air traffic control, the government really needs to invest in infrastructure around different industries. And this is a new infrastructure. So our focus in this was to say, these dollars are not sustainable. You cannot create an industry of supporting farmers on large payments. This can push some growers early on into the right direction, and we love that. But our focus was on making sure the dollars are used for creating data sets and then being able to validate and verify models that in a market-based way can then increase the opportunity for farmers into the future. So our whole focus was to say our involvement will be around infrastructure and making sure that these dollars are used. There's a particularly favorable group of politicians in place right now. That might not be the case in the future. While it's here, let's go collect some serious data that can help everyone and all US farmers. And I think there's global outcome from that as well. That's quite compelling. So excited to participate in those. Our model that we have the license for overall through, as Christoph talked about, the soil metrics company, that's the DECENT model. It underpins many of the calculations in terms of the summarization of the outcomes from the study overall. So we're excited to work with a number of different partners on that quantification element as well. But mostly I'm excited. Our particular program was around beef and cattle production and low carbon beef, and thinking about rotational grazing and the significant data gap that exists there to properly quantify that to the right uncertainty level, such that we can accurately then consider the environmental impacts and benefits of those types of cropping and cattle systems.
OK, merci Chris. Christophe, sur l'initiative de l'USDA.
Yeah, so we are excited to lead one of the grants, and we were participating in a few others, and we wrote one behind the scenes that we'll still be involved in, all in the cropping or dairy side of things. The one that we're leading is around creating end-to-end supply chain connections, basically to optimize management, feed management for dairy cows, enhancing food grade commodities for human consumption, better nutrient and manure on farm operations. A lot of the funding will go to infrastructure investments, such as de-hullers for soy. And what I think is interesting about the United States is this money, I believe, will be part to inform how the Farm Bill shapes out over the coming years. And so this is the US Department of Agriculture's way of saying, let's invest in innovation in industry to see what can be determined here, and also to see how can we ultimately support develop programs that support all farmers. The common ground here, I mean, what's interesting, yeah, it's delayed. So we have to say we've been tentatively awarded. None of us has actually gotten it or begun work on it. But what we do know is that the USDA will be looking for all sort of interventions determined under conservation practice codes. And so it's a good way to see how does a US agency that has expertise within this say, we've developed these conservation practice codes. As Chris alluded to, Soil Metrics is a great partner that's able to take in some of these conservation practice codes to generate estimates. And so it's a valuable way to both use that tool and create an open space for more tools. And then for those activities or interventions that don't neatly fall into a conservation practice code, supporting environmental impact assessments. So
OK. OK, Christophe, merci à tous les trois pour ces réponses qui montrent bien qu'on est, certes, il y a le développement de marchés volontaires privés, avec des acteurs privés, mais néanmoins, on peut parler, je pense, de partenariats public-privé, avec beaucoup d'insistance mise finalement sur des questions d'infrastructure, d'innovation, de recherche, sur qu'est-ce qu'on mesure, comment on mesure, et puis des questions également de d'organisation de la chaîne de valeur, d'organisation des filières. J'aimerais maintenant donc passer la parole à Édouard Lancrier. Édouard est directeur du développement à AgroSolutions. Ça fait maintenant un petit moment, Édouard, que vous regardez, et plus que ça, que vous travaillez sur les marchés du carbone pour la France, mais forcément également avec une vision globale, européenne et même mondiale. Donc, et en particulier donc, sur l'agriculture bas carbone, avec la volonté, bien sûr, que l'agriculture française réussisse sa transition vers le bas carbone. Alors, première chose, Édouard, peut-être, compte tenu de votre expérience et la lumière, justement, d'où on en est en France, quelle réaction suscitent les trois présentations auxquelles vous venez d'assister?
Alors,
Édouard, vous avez la parole.
très bien. Merci Jean-Christophe pour l'invitation. En effet, donc pour le rappeler, AgroSolutions, on travaille, notre expertise, c'est la transition environnementale de l'agriculture dans tous ses impacts environnementaux. Et donc, on est en particulier positionné sur l'accompagnement à la transition bas carbone de l'agriculture française, européenne et de plus en plus internationale. En France, on a été très impliqué dans le déploiement du dispositif label bas carbone, puisqu'on a rédigé beaucoup de méthodes qui sont validées au label bas carbone. On a créé les outils digitaux qui automatisent ces méthodes pour mettre en place les diagnostics sur les fermes et calculer les crédits carbone. On accompagne des programmes de crédit carbone, mais en parallèle de ces programmes de crédit carbone, on accompagne aussi beaucoup d'acteurs de l'agro-food industry, des agro-industriels, dans des programmes de réduction de leur impact sur ce qu'on appelle le scope 3, donc réduction de l'impact climatique de leur sourcing agricole, avec pour le coup des méthodes qui sont cadrées par le GHG protocole, qui sont compatibles avec le SBTI et qui ont des approches qui jusqu'ici étaient assez différentes des méthodes qu'on utilise pour calculer des crédits carbone. Aujourd'hui, toutes ces approches sont en train de converger, on les déploie sur le terrain, avec avec parfois certaines limites, notamment pour la capacité à produire des crédits carbone auxquels est confrontée une grande partie de l'agriculture française. Et c'est sur ces limites que je voudrais m'attarder aujourd'hui et en profiter pour poser quelques questions à nos amis de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique pour qu'ils nous partagent leur retour sur ces expériences limitantes qu'on peut avoir pour le démarrage du marché du carbone en agriculture. Ce que je voudrais pointer, c'est en particulier deux paradoxes qu'on a dans la transition, plutôt des paradoxes qu'on a dans le financement de la transition bas carbone de l'agriculture et qui expliquent pour moi une certaine limite à engager un grand nombre d'agriculteurs dans cette transition. Christopher l'a rappelé, 97% des agriculteurs aux États-Unis sont très réticents à rentrer dans un programme carbone. Donc, moi, je m'intéresse surtout à ces agriculteurs qui ont du mal à rentrer dans ces programmes, malgré le fait qu'ils en ont sans doute très envie. Il faut d'abord constater que le décollage du marché des crédits carbone en agriculture est quand même très compliqué et beaucoup moins rapide qu'on l'avait espéré initialement. Il y a 2-3 ans, il y a eu une véritable fièvre du carbone en agriculture. On s'est dit que l'agriculture allait gagner beaucoup d'argent avec les crédits carbone. Alors, le marché des crédits carbone, il explose. Hein. Dans le monde, il valait 1 milliard d'euros en 2021. Il va sans doute atterrir autour de 2 milliards d'euros en 2022 et il est annoncé comme avec une très, très grande croissance pour rapidement atteindre les 10 milliards d'euros. Donc, c'est colossal. Pour autant, la part des crédits carbone, enfin, au sein de ce marché des crédits carbone, l'agriculture décolle très, très peu. C'est assez difficile d'avoir une vision globale de la part des projets agricoles dans ce marché mondial des crédits carbone, mais selon les estimations, c'est entre 0,2 et 1% des volumes de crédits carbone qui sont issus de l'agriculture. Alors même que l'agriculture est un secteur absolument incontournable pour la lutte contre le changement climatique parce que c'est le seul secteur qui peut à la fois réduire ses émissions et stocker du carbone. Or, l'atteinte de la neutralité climatique, c'est réduire les émissions de la planète et stocker du carbone. L'agriculture est le seul secteur qui peut faire ça et pourtant elle ne décolle pas dans les marchés du crédit carbone. Pourquoi ? on a maintenant un peu d'expérience et de recul sur les programmes de crédit carbone en agriculture, et ce qu'on constate, c'est que les acteurs de la finance carbone, ces acteurs qui font 98% de ces volumes de la finance carbone, les grands fonds d'investissement, qui au départ étaient très intéressés par les crédits carbone en agriculture, ont du mal à rentrer dans ces crédits carbone. Parce qu'un crédit carbone d'offset, qui est un actif financier, il doit répondre aux règles de permanence, de double compte et d'additionnalité. Je n'ai pas le temps de rentrer dans le détail ici, mais ces 3 règles, elles sont très, très difficiles à garantir sur un crédit carbone issu de l'agriculture. En particulier, la règle du double compte. Le double compte, c'est quoi? C'est quand je produis un crédit carbone, je dois garantir à l'acheteur du crédit carbone, par exemple un grand groupe industriel, que le bénéfice climatique qui est enregistré dans ce crédit, il va être comptabilisé par aucun autre acteur. Or, comment vous voulez garantir, quand vous produisez un crédit carbone en agriculture, que l'acteur agro-industriel qui réalise son sourcing sur la même ferme ne va pas comptabiliser ça dans son scope 3? C'est très compliqué. Comment vous voulez garantir que l'agriculteur qui a une rotation colza, blé, orge, par exemple, et qui exporte l'une de ses cultures pour produire des biocarburants, ne va pas chercher à obtenir la prime biocarburant, qui chez nous est le mécanisme financier qui me rémunère les plus grandes surfaces de transition bas carbone? Et vous n'avez pas de coordination entre les programmes qui génèrent des crédits carbone, les programmes prime biocarburant bas carbone et les programmes de scope 3. En tout cas, pas pour le moment. C'est l'une des raisons parmi les autres pour lesquelles les fonds d'investissement, qui sont extrêmement vigilants, extrêmement scrupuleux sur ces 3 critères sur les crédits carbone, eh bien finalement ne sautent pas le pas, ne franchissent pas le pas de l'investissement dans les crédits carbone issus de l'agriculture. En tout cas, c'est l'analyse que j'en ai moi. Au-delà du fait qu'en agriculture, l'agriculture a un formidable potentiel pour réduire ses émissions et stocker du carbone, mais ça coûte beaucoup plus cher que dans les autres secteurs qui peuvent le faire, que sont la forêt ou l'énergie. C'est aussi une des raisons des difficultés de cette transition. Donc, on a ce premier paradoxe où l'agriculture recèle un formidable potentiel de lutte contre le changement climatique par la réduction et le stockage, et pour autant, elle n'arrive pas à attirer, autant qu'on l'aurait espéré, l'argent de la finance carbone volontaire. Le deuxième paradoxe que je voudrais pointer, c'est, comment dire, celui entre la capacité absolue de l'agriculture, son rôle incontournable dans la transition, et le très très haut degré d'exigence sur les robustesses des méthodes scientifiques qui sont utilisées pour mesurer les émissions et le stockage, qui est tout à fait entendable. Et tous les grands standards sont en train de converger vers une plus haute exigence méthodologique. En particulier le GHG protocole, qui est utilisé par les entreprises qui veulent atteindre leurs objectifs SBTI. J'ai parcouru la dernière version qui va sortir d'ici juin, qui est d'application au LEN sector, et elle converge vers une rigueur semblable à celle du label bas carbone ou des grandes méthodes de carbone farming. On a un paradoxe parce que cette rigueur de reporting environnemental, cette grande lourdeur de mise en œuvre des méthodes, elle rend très difficile ce qu'on appelle le monitoring, reporting, vérification. Ces programmes, en fait, mesurer finement, rendre compte des réductions d'émissions et du stockage de carbone avec des méthodes aussi lourdes, mais très robustes, ça coûte très, très cher. Et les agriculteurs, ça requiert de collecter énormément de données pour une rémunération carbone qui n'est pas gigantesque. Et au final, ça crée une forme de méfiance des agriculteurs, en tout cas de moindre volonté d'entrer dans ces programmes, surtout quand on a une flambée des cours du blé comme on a actuellement. Et le paradoxe, c'est que ce très haut degré d'exigence qui est là pour garantir que nos actions sont bien au bénéfice du climat, eh bien finalement, à court terme, il est responsable d'un report de la mise en place des bonnes pratiques. Parce que les bonnes pratiques en agriculture, elles sont assez simples. Tout ce qui permet de réduire des émissions et de stocker du carbone, les pratiques de l'agriculture de régénération, qui sont également vertueuses pour la biodiversité et pour l'eau, on les connaît tous et elles sont assez simples. Mais comme on a un tel degré d'exigence sur le reporting et la robustesse des méthodes, eh bien, on peine à lancer le système. On a un retard à l'allumage et un retard au décollage des programmes. Donc, ces 2 paradoxes, pour moi, illustrent quelque chose de finalement assez triste, c'est que tout ça retarde la capacité de l'agriculture à rentrer dans la course climatique. Donc, la question que je pose, et celle que je pose à nos dirigeants français et européens quand j'ai l'occasion de discuter avec eux, C'est compte tenu de cette formidable opportunité qu'on a avec l'agriculture de gérer la transition climatique, compte tenu de cette très grande particularité de l'agriculture, une économie très complexe, les coûts de transition sont élevés, mais le potentiel est élevé. Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas finalement créer un système spécial dédié à l'agriculture, qui soit différent de celui dont on a dans le secteur de l'énergie et dans la forêt, trouver un mécanisme de financement adapté à l'agriculture pour financer ces actions dont on sait qu'elles sont vertueuses. Et derrière, prendre le temps de mettre en place des programmes de mesure et de reporting scientifiquement robustes. Je pense que c'est le bon moment pour poser cette question parce que derrière, elle pose la question de l'articulation entre les programmes privés et publics. On a vu l'importance de ce qu'est capable de faire l'USDA, donc le département d'agriculture américain. En Europe, on est sous la direction de la Commission européenne qui va annoncer le 30 novembre les grandes lignes directrices du dispositif du carbon farming. Néanmoins, on sait que c'est des grandes lignes directrices et qu'on va avoir la place pendant quelques années pour avoir une discussion constructive entre l'agriculture et le régulateur pour voir comment on avance. Et donc, la question que je pose, c'est est-ce que finalement, on ne remettrait pas à plat les règles fondamentales de la finance carbone qui ont tant de mal à s'appliquer à l'agriculture pour penser un système adapté à l'agriculture pour permettre d'accélérer cette transition. Et dans un tel système, quelle peut être la complémentarité entre les régulateurs publics et les acteurs privés? C'est un peu une question fleuve, mais j'espère que nos intervenants auront des choses à répondre là-dessus.
Oui, merci Edouard. Effectivement, c'est une grande question. Je pense que le mieux, c'est de prendre tout de suite les réactions de nos trois intervenants. Alors, est-ce qu'il faut persister en quelque sorte dans l'amélioration de ce qui est déjà lancé ou bien réécrire plus radicalement les règles du jeu si on suit le raisonnement d'Edouard? Qui veut commencer? Peut-être avec Déby.
Well, Edouard, I think we are, in fact, this is one of the reasons actually ESMC started. We are, in fact, playing under rules, market rules that were developed for point sources of pollution. Agriculture is a series of managed biological systems, right? They are not point sources. So how you quantify is different than how you quantify in other systems. The other thing is, in the United States, we have 2 million farmers and ranchers farming and ranching their own small businesses. They don't do things the same way. They don't do things the same way year to year, even sometimes week to week or right, month to month, because they're dealing with weather and climate and other variables like pests. I completely agree that the rules need to be far more flexible to accommodate farming and ranching. And I also think we should not ignore the fact that carbon is not the only thing we should be looking at. We need to be looking at the entire landscape-based approach. I will say that there is a movement right now to tackle this, particularly in the scope 3 arena, right? Tackle ways to do this that are more flexible and work for agriculture. I think it's complicated to talk about maybe even compare offsets to insets, for instance, or the offset world to the the supply chain, scope 3 supply chain sector, because when you're selling an offset, you are selling something to another sector or company that actually increases their emissions commensurate with the amount of offsets they purchase. That is not what is happening in supply chains, right? They are absolute removals or absolute emission reductions that are not allowing an equivalent amount to be released elsewhere. So you would think that the rules should be more flexible for supply chain reporting than for offset markets, and yet they're not. This requirement to monitor removals from whence they came, from the fields and the farms they came, in perpetuity in supply chain markets does not make sense. And that is where I think we need a lot of thinking about the entire landscape-based approach and land-based approach. We do need to quantify what's happening for specific crop production systems, livestock production systems better than we are, but perhaps not to the degree that we're doing it right now and requiring it in markets. I completely agree with you. Now is the time to think through the rules we're operating under and take all of the lessons, the three of us here and others, yourself included, and apply that to how do we actually build a better mousetrap that can engage farmers and ranchers who are in fact running a business, and then achieve the outcomes that we all need to achieve in the time scales that we need to achieve them to really make a difference.
Merci Debbie. Chris, mais une réflexion à entendre à la fois les commentaires d'Edouard, la réponse de Debbie. Quand on fait du insetting, donc pour la réduction scope 3, les questions, enfin les difficultés qu'évoque Edouard sur la permanence, sur le double comptage, sur l'additionnalité, on n'a pas vraiment ces difficultés, ou il me semble qu'elles se posent avec moins d'acuité par rapport à la compensation et à la vente de crédit carbone. Est-ce que ça voudrait dire que l'avenir est plutôt à de l'insetting plutôt qu'à la compensation carbone? Peut-être un mot là-dessus, Debbie, et puis ensuite on passera la parole à Chris.
Setting should be, but the definition of an inset is an offset that is achieved within your supply chain. So we're starting with that definition, which I think has been hampering us. But because you're not allowing an equivalent amount of emissions elsewhere for an inset, right, for a scope 3 emission reduction, then it should not be more difficult to quantify and verify within scope 3 than it is for carbon offsets. But right now it is.
It is, okay. Chris, vos commentaires?
Yeah, I think we have a problem on our hands, right? We have an atmosphere that is telling us that it has a problem, and we have a few years to figure that out. And to me, I was thinking about the paradoxes there and thinking about growth, and the perception that the market in the US is not progressing as fast as maybe some had hoped. This is all price driven in the end. So we've seen this growth. We started out with our first year, I said 19,000 credits. It was a few 100,000 acres. That program scaled in the course of less than a year to well over 1 million, to now 5 million to 7 million acres participating in that. That's growth in less than 18 months. We've seen something grow from a few 100K to millions. That is significant, right? So I think it's wrong to say that it's not. Now, there are farmers, very vocal farmers. 5% of US agriculture has historically been involved in these type of practices, and they have a different opinion. I should be paid for what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Well, maybe from a government program, that's acceptable. But when you're thinking about these market mechanisms, we're asking for a very particular thing, to be created, and you have to do something new. In order to sell a corn crop, you have to plant corn. The new thing had to happen that year. The same thing, I think, for carbon programs. I think we should hold everything to the same high standards. The registries right now, these are achievable methods. These are scientifically rigorous. They stand up into accounting. I think if we get into a world where scope 3 and offsetting, there's no way for these supply chains to reach net zero without some form of offsetting in businesses, as long as any company flies a jet or has trucking or shipping or trains that require any kind of fossil fuels. That's not achievable as a net zero without offsets. So they have to go hand in hand. To me, the accounting needs to be fluid. You need to be able to, just like in corporate accounting, you have your books and ends up with dollars or the currency at the end. The same thing on the carbon accounting has to be comparable. So I think mixing standards is highly problematic, and I'm a big fan for saying we're able to do this. Why not do it everywhere? When I think about the true driver around complexity, are these too rigorous? Is this too difficult to do? It's not too difficult to do. We've proven that. What's challenging is the price. All right, and when we think about the societal cost of a ton of release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere today, there was a paper in Nature a few weeks ago that talked about it being well over 100 $165, $175 per ton of the cost today. So if we emit 1 ton today in 2022, its cost on society is well over $170. And we have just now started talking about carbon credits at $40. So I think until society starts to value the efforts and the value of the asset that a farmer can create, we've got an imbalance. And part of that is, in the CPG world, unwillingness maybe to pay at those levels. And we're trying to creep that price up. But if society decides, or regulation can say, $140 is the cheapest a carbon credit can be sold, we would see a transformation, and agriculture would adopt this instantly. All the technology is there. Cover cropping, no-till, these different practices. You have the people, the workforce, the immensity of agriculture, and everything coming together, you could absolutely scale it. So, I look at those kind of paradoxes more from an optimist perspective and say, I think it's driven by price. And if we get society to pay correctly, which means all of us have to redefine what we're willing to pay for products, we end up in a situation where these markets work and farmers will get properly compensated for this wonderful effort. We're not making any more forests. In fact, we're losing 7 gigatons of forest a year. Mangroves sound fantastic, but mangroves will be underwater. That's a challenged environment. Agriculture is a huge reservoir of potential for carbon. And we have a limited window when agriculture can work. If the temperatures rise too much, agriculture fails on a large scale too. And then we lose that ability to abate the greatest challenges.
Merci, Chris. Christophe.
I think the paradox is very real. And I think the 3 of us panelists would agree farmers should be compensated and paid more for their pro-environmental activities. And the key question here is how and under what terms. The voluntary versus compliance. I would just say, as a US taxpayer, I would be thrilled for some of my taxpayer money to go directly to farmers for delivering this good, not necessarily to offset my emissions or balance the books, but to say there is a real environmental service you're providing, you should be rewarded for it. And I do think the voluntary markets, whether it's insetting or offsetting, create a type of innovation sandbox through which we can have greater confidence around how sure we can be, and also how informed can those who are the implementers of these activities to know that what they do in a certain context makes sense. I think we're losing a bit of, we're restricting ourselves by keeping a carbon-based price, because you can't talk about carbon without talking about water, without talking about nitrogen when looking at ag-based systems. And so I think, going back to my comments of how practical are these markets without including farmers, not just the vocal ones who are saying pay us for past practices, but the ones who are sitting on the sidelines and say, I won't enter this arrangement unless X, Y, and Z change. And so I guess if in terms of, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and don't reinvent the rules entirely, there are rules that do need to be revised and rewritten. And I think we've got an opportunity, as Chris says, in a limited window to get something right or get something that sees greater progress. What concerns me, well, there's a few things that concern me, but Debbie used the term greenwashing. And it's interesting because the fear of greenwashing is actually what is driving a lot of the complexity of these rules, because companies want to be sure, they want to say, I don't want anyone to accuse me that I am greenwashing because I'm making these broad claims. And I think if we stepped back and said, well, those companies that really succeed actually acknowledge they're not perfect. Things aren't perfect. It's an experiment, and saying this isn't a greenwash. I'm not overstating what's actually possible. And so I think if in fact we stepped back a bit to say, no, we don't have it all figured out. In fact, we are participating in the world's greatest science experiment that says things change. This drought that may occur is going to release a whole bunch of carbon. Well, someone can't claim that in their supply chain, but it also wasn't the direct fault of anyone in the individualist sense, in the sense that the weather and the climate has been changing and is continuing to change more rapidly. And if I were to push a few other thoughts, it would be the key word here is actually risk, not risk around carbon markets, but about risk that a farmer faces that they're considering every day they're out in the field, and what options do they have to mitigate against that risk. Here where I live in the Colorado River Basin, drought is top of mind, and we're experiencing a decadal mega drought. And it's proven that if you do have your field covered for a longer period of time, you are more resilient against that drought. You are able to get into the field when others who haven't adopted these soil health practices are there. And similarly, the data that can inform one to do these activities versus another, and the assets that might be backed, and the ways that banks might look at this and say, I want to support and write loans to farmers who are a lower risk because they're adopting these soil health practices, which as a proxy increases more carbon. I think we might find ourselves with a little more flexibility and an opportunity to see new rules emerging that are commensurate with the practical decisions farmers are making.
Ok, merci Christophe. Un élément que rappelait Christophe d'ailleurs en citant le sondage tout récent publié dans le Farm Journal, une des préoccupations qui expliquerait le fait que beaucoup d'agriculteurs sont intéressés par les marchés du carbone, mais en même temps se déclarent pas prêts parce qu'ils se posent un certain nombre de questions. Et une de ces questions, c'est comment est-ce qu'on rémunère et comment est-ce qu'on rémunère les agriculteurs qui ont déjà des pratiques favorables. Donc, c'est certaines formes de remise en cause de la notion d'additionnalité qui est exigée pour générer des crédits. Debbie et Chris, quelle est votre réponse à cette préoccupation des agriculteurs?
Programs, we have a lot of heavily subsidized government programs that pay for environmental outcomes. They are not as highly monitored or quantified as what we do in a market program, but we do have means to pay farmers for their outcomes, including what they've done in the past. I do think that is a perfect government role because you will not be selling that. Our government does take credit for those outcomes that have happened in the past as part of our inventory, et cetera, right? So I think that's the perfect place to take account of what has happened in the past. I do think, however, in a market program where a company has an inventory, we need to do a better job of accounting for growers they are buying from, who are in fact early adopters, who have done the right thing, whose baselines are much higher than the baselines of someone who is coming in and being paid for what they've done. We have not fully cracked that nut. And I think we need to do that because that would allow even private companies to then make claims based on purchasing from early adopters whose baselines are much higher than some of their own neighbors and from whom we all benefit, including that company. So I think there's multiple ways to do that in both the public sector and the private sector.
OK. Chris, sur le même sujet, la même question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking. I mean, I'm agreeing with Debbie in many ways there, and it's the other area of question. I think Christoph brought up this a little bit about the farmers and the costs in their business. And we think about land as being a cost and that risk of is my rent, my cash rent, going to go up as a result of performing one of these programs? And yeah, it probably will. I mean, if you think about it, it probably should. I mean, if the land itself is the customer here, and if we're storing something, just like if you had someone store their bicycle in your garage and you charge them for it, that's literally something. They stop paying you and you might decide you can't keep your bicycle in my garage anymore. That sort of concept here is maybe the analogy that can be used for agriculture. But if we think of land being the true customer, that's the ultimate point for a farmer to really consider, is that the farmer is ephemeral. They're there for a short period of time. The landowner is there for some time longer. but we're talking on the order of 100 years plus in terms of permanence and those sorts of things. So really the land is the customer. So we have to think about ways of being continuity and having continuity between the stewards of the land. The particular farmer, how does that farmer transition to the next farmer? How does that landowner transition to the next landowner? How do those programs stay continuous across that? It's very doable. Just have to think about it in a very long context, but very achievable. And that I think ultimately, to me, if a farmer is concerned about their cash rent going up as a result of participating in a carbon program, in a crop share, they would split that 50-50 with the landowner, the revenue from the crop itself, as an example of the US practice. So I think there's opportunities for them to really not be so concerned there. I believe that market mechanism works its way out. If your primary crop brings in $1,000 per acre of revenue and a carbon credit brings in $25 or $30 and your rent goes up by $2 or $3, it may not be because of the carbon credit, but if a carbon credit is, or any of these ecosystem service concepts are hundreds of dollars and on the order of 20 to 50% of the revenue from a field, according to classic agriculture, then I think it becomes an issue where a landowner and a farmer should work it out. But I think it's worked out in the cash rent arrangement. That's a contractual relationship between the landowner and the farmer at some point. So anyway, just wanted to bring that out there, that I think that's, although it is a concern and it should work its way out, we really do have to think about the customer on the other side of this being the land itself. And the land is what's able to secure this carbon from our atmosphere.
Merci Chris. Debbie, une question sur ce que représente aujourd'hui aux États-Unis le marché de la compensation en biodiversité. C'est un gros marché, il y a beaucoup de choses qui se font.
Yeah, so we are operating our biodiversity within our supply chain reporting. I will say two things. There is demand, but there's great uncertainty about what it is that's required for a company to show that they are having an impact, right? There is no agreement yet on what the appropriate metrics are. And I think that's because biodiversity is very, very localized, right? Mm-hmm. What is important in one region, which might be flyways for certain avian species, is different perhaps than in another region, right? Which may in fact be amphibious species, right? So we have several projects where we have been generating biodiversity credits, and it's interesting because to date, they've been state agency partners, mostly interested in the outcomes. But our buyers have said, yes, we are interested as the space, as the requirements for science-based target network, which looks at water, land, and biodiversity. As those requirements continue to evolve, I think we will see more buyers. So we're just learning by doing with our companies through pilot projects on the ground, very focused on crop and then livestock systems, because grasslands in particular, I think pasturelands, beef grazing, have tremendous opportunity for biodiversity that I think is largely untapped.
Debbie, dans une de vos slides, une de vos diapositives, il y avait l'expression stacked credits, c'est-à-dire une multiplicité de crédits qui sont générés par une pratique agricole, par la même pratique agricole, par une pratique agricole donnée. Je me demande si ce n'est pas une des réponses aux préoccupations qui ont été soulevées notamment par Christophe Josp, sur le fait de peut-être pas se concentrer uniquement sur le carbone, mais également pouvoir valoriser d'autres fonctions qui sont générées en même temps, que ce soit des économies d'eau, que ce soit une amélioration de la qualité de l'eau, que ce soit peut-être une meilleure conservation de la biodiversité. Est-ce que cette notion donc d'empilement de crédits, de crédits accumulés en quelque sorte, c'est quelque chose d'important dans votre travail?
Yes, and that is something we do. So we have one integrated approach. So everything a farmer or rancher does on the ground, we quantify. We have one data collection system that can quantify those multiple outcomes. all of our buyers are interested in carbon first and foremost. Most of them are also interested in water. So we can generate a water quality credit, and we do, and it's at a fraction of the cost of what it costs to generate the carbon. Water quantity, we are still working on, because we have 16 states in the West that operate under Western water law that complicates these things. But yes, our entire intent is when a corporate purchases something, they get the water, both quality and quantity, where quantity is possible, and then biodiversity as an additional benefit that has incremental additional costs, but then creates improved payments and payment opportunities for farmers and ranchers. I think those integrated landscape-based systems are necessary now, because we know water is a critical component of climate change, whether it's drought or flooding or other, severe events. And if we're monitoring and tracking one outcome and not the entire suite, and we're not also paying for them and valuing them, and I really appreciate the discussion about the value of these ecosystem services, then we will not be focusing on all of the land-based resource conservation, preservation, restoration issues that we as a society need to. And companies are starting to do that. They are, under SBTN, looking at their corporate footprint and how it impacts water risk, water resource utilization, and biodiversity. I do see these markets starting to come together, but I agree with Chris Harbort that we have to better value these services in order to scale the stewardship on the ground that will actually result in those improved services.
OK. Est-ce que vous avez un exemple aujourd'hui de paiement pour services environnemental concernant l'économie d'eau, la conservation de l'eau? Vous avez parlé de l'amélioration de la qualité de l'eau, mais aujourd'hui, véritablement, Christophe tout à l'heure rappelé dans le Colorado et plus généralement dans une bonne partie de l'Ouest américain et même au-delà, vers le centre, il y a ce qui se passe actuellement aux États-Unis sur la sécheresse est un problème majeur. Est-ce qu'un marché de paiement pour services écosystémiques a quelque chose à dire et à faire dans ce registre?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we are just now wrapping up with some partners an assessment of the entire Western region of the country, which does operate under water quantity markets and Western water law, and looking at both demand and supply analysis. And part of that requires that we consider land use and what we do if a drought does remove land from agricultural production, right? And how you accommodate that and accommodate farmer and rancher livelihoods, right? So I think there are multiple things that you have to think about there, but that assessment is showing us that we need to be more flexible, and we do need to consider water use in a way that protects farmer and rancher rights, but also allows them to continue to be economically viable when there is a drought, right? What can we push them towards? What alternatives can we give them? What tools can we put into their toolbox to remain economically viable and maybe crop switch? And so that's a whole body of work we're engaged in. But the assessment that we're completing is actually really doing a great job of informing opportunities there.
OK, merci Debbie. Nous approchons de la fin de ce webinaire. Avant de passer la parole au président Pluriagri, Édouard, quelques réflexions à nouveau et éventuellement le temps de poser une ou deux questions.
Excusez-moi. Non, merci aux panélistes pour leur retour d'expérience sur ce qui se passe de l'autre côté des États-Unis. Je voudrais quand même revenir sur deux remarques qui ont été réalisées par Debbie et Chris, et je suis complètement d'accord avec les différents éléments qu'ils ont avancés. Le premier, je vais prendre trois remarques qui, pour moi, justifient quand même la nécessité de se donner un peu le temps d'adapter les règles de la finance carbone à l'agriculture, si on veut permettre cet essor. Et ça me semble également nécessaire pour faire augmenter le prix du crédit carbone en agriculture. C'est absolument indispensable et on est tous d'accord là-dessus. Le premier élément, c'est la spécificité sociale de l'agriculture. Ça a été exposé par Déby. En agriculture, il y a beaucoup d'agriculteurs qui sont des leaders historiques, qui ont des bonnes pratiques. Et avec les règles actuelles de la finance carbone, c'est difficile, voire impossible, de les rémunérer. Or, l'agriculture a cela de spécifique que vous ne pouvez pas prendre des acteurs isolés qui sont, entre guillemets, les moins bons élèves sur le carbone et les rémunérer. Il y a des dynamiques sociales de territoire qui sont importantes à prendre en compte. Si vous ne rémunérez pas ceux qui historiquement ont pris des risques et qui sont généralement ceux qui ont la plus de capacité à innover dans l'agriculture, vous risquez de tuer un système. Et le retour de terrain est unanime en ce sens. Et c'est important de prendre en compte ce retour de terrain. Donc, il faut déjà être une adaptation. Je ne dis pas qu'il faut remettre toutes les règles de la finance carbone à plat. Je ne dis pas qu'il faut avoir des méthodes simplistes. C'est important d'avoir des méthodes très solides, et on les a. Mais c'est sur l'adaptation de ces méthodes au projet de territoire. Donc déjà, avoir une approche par territoire, par réalité sociale, avec peut-être des groupes d'agriculteurs, où on agrégerait des gens qui ont de l'avance, qui ont peut-être moins de capacité à améliorer leurs pratiques, mais qui ont des choses à enseigner aux autres et qui peuvent les accompagner dans le risque que représente la transition agricole. Ça me semblerait déjà, je pense, quelque chose de pragmatique pour avancer. Le deuxième élément, c'est la terre. Chris a parlé du statut de de la différence entre le propriétaire de la terre et l'utilisateur. Et c'est profondément vrai. Ce qui se passe, c'est que par contre, c'est très, très différent. On a des réalités foncières extrêmement différentes dans les différents endroits du globe. Et là où c'est le plus complexe, c'est en Europe de l'Ouest, parce qu'on a une histoire agricole très, très longue et qu'on a des recoupements, des remorcellements, des remembrements agricoles qui font qu'on a un statut foncier extrêmement complexe qui, à mon avis, est aussi un frein à adapter, à faire une finance carbone comme on l'a fait ailleurs. Mais ça illustre la nécessité, quand bien même on a des règles qui sont cadrées à une échelle internationale, d'être capable de les adapter au niveau local. Et donc, on a besoin de marge d'adaptation. Et le dernier élément, je voudrais quand même revenir sur cette course à la robustesse scientifique. Si vous observez les différentes méthodes qui sont validées par le VCS, le Gold Standard, le GAG Protocole, depuis 10 ans, pour mesurer l'impact climatique de l'agriculture ou pour générer un crédit carbone, vous allez constater une course à la robustesse. Pourquoi? Parce que dès lors que vous avez une approche méthodologique qui est validée par le VCS ou un autre acteur, considérée comme super robuste pour mesurer le carbone stocké dans la terre, vous avez juste ensuite une crise scientifique, vous avez des groupes de scientifiques qui vont venir critiquer tout ça. Pourquoi? Et c'est inévitable, et qui vont dire, mais attendez, vous n'avez pas pris en compte telle ou telle spécificité. La dernière controverse scientifique en cours, c'est sur la permanence. Vous avez des scientifiques qui arrivent en disant, avec le changement climatique, il devient impossible de garantir la permanence du carbone stocké parce que les effets du changement climatique vont générer un accroissement de la minéralisation qu'aucun modèle, même le plus puissant, ne peut mesurer. Et ils ont raison. Mais ce n'est pas pour ça que les méthodes ne sont pas robustes. Mais il faut revenir à l'humilité, à une forme d'humilité. Mesurer le carbone stocké dans le sol et le représenter par un modèle. On a des modèles très solides, on en a des très bons, mais on est quand même très loin d'être capable d'englober l'intégralité de ce qui se passe dans le sol. Et il va falloir beaucoup de temps avant qu'on puisse être capable de le faire. Donc, si on est dans une course en avant où on prétend avoir des méthodes qui sont fiables et robustes à 100%, on va en permanence s'exposer à cette critique scientifique, à cette controverse scientifique qui est fondée et qui va avoir pour objet de remettre en cause les anciennes méthodes et de devoir créer une nouvelle méthode, de la faire enregistrer par Vera pour la réappliquer. Chaque méthode, à chaque fois, est de plus en plus complexe à appliquer à l'agriculteur. Donc, soit on est dans cette course contre la montre, enfin, dans cette fuite en avant sur une robustesse scientifique toujours plus forte des méthodes, il faut quand même qu'on progresse dans la robustesse. Soit, si on fait le constat que cette fuite en avant, elle est délétère pour engager la transition, on peut se dire, bon, quelle alternative on peut avoir pour déjà démarrer les pratiques dont on sait qu'elles sont vertueuses, les rémunérer et en parallèle continuer à mettre à jour et adapter les méthodes scientifiques. Et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, on est quand même un peu coincé dans cette course en avant et ça freine notamment la capacité à aller chercher plus d'argent Pourquoi? Parce que, juste pour terminer, ces fonds d'investissement dont on a besoin pour faire monter le coût du crédit carbone, ils ont un comité scientifique qui regarde quelle est la controverse scientifique sur le crédit carbone, et tant qu'elle n'est pas réglée, ils nous disent bon, bah, on est un peu frileux, ou alors on va mettre uniquement du love money pour voir. Donc je pense qu'il faut qu'on se mette autour de la table et qu'on arrive à gérer cette question. Voilà un peu pour la dernière ligne.
Merci beaucoup Edouard. Merci à tous nos intervenants. Je voudrais passer la parole pour conclure à Arnaud Rousseau, donc le président de Pluriagri, puisque on arrive au terme de ce webinaire. Arnaud?
Oui, bah, écoutez, d'abord, un très grand merci parce que c'était passionnant. Bon, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses, hein. J'avoue avec humilité que dans ce domaine, mon niveau de compétence n'est pas optimum, mais c'était particulièrement intéressant de voir les sujets. Moi, peut-être pour relever quelques commentaires qui ont été faits, on sent bien qu'on a un enjeu de timing, un enjeu de temps, et que si on veut relever le challenge d'une forme de neutralité carbone en 2050, il va quand même falloir qu'on se mette rapidement en action. Et donc, ce qui vient d'être dit précédemment par Edouard montre que si on passe beaucoup de temps à essayer de caler les systèmes, on risque d'avoir quand même quelques sujets de délai et finalement une problématique de dynamique. Le deuxième, c'est l'aspect volume, ça a été redit. La question, c'est est-ce qu'on emmène quelques-uns vers l'excellence, où on essaie d'emmener, je dirais, le gros des acteurs de la terre, c'est-à-dire les agriculteurs, à une amélioration des pratiques. Est-ce qu'on se focalise sur l'excellence de quelques-uns ou sur l'amélioration continue du plus grand nombre, avec ce que moi je qualifie de vertueux, et je reprends exactement ce que vient de dire Edouard, c'est faisons attention que ceux qui soient les plus grands bénéficiaires ne soient pas ceux qui soient les plus loin de la problématique, et veillons à ce que ceux qui ont toujours été un peu leaders sur le sujet gardent cette dynamique et servent de courroie d'entraînement. Bon, ensuite, on voit bien qu'au regard de ce qui a été décrit par nos amis aux États-Unis, on aura quand même besoin à un moment, au-delà des modèles, d'une forme d'harmonisation. Parce que si on veut qu'à terme, le marché soit un marché dynamique, soit un marché liquide, soit un marché rémunérateur, il faut qu'on veille à ne pas avoir une trop grande multiplicité des modèles qui, finalement, avec des datas identiques, amèneraient à des conclusions qui peuvent être différentes, voire opposées. Et on a déjà vécu ça dans d'autres domaines, je pense notamment aux biocarburants. Voilà, donc c'est particulièrement passionnant. Il y a une attente forte du monde agricole, à la fois comme source de solutions, comme amélioration, vecteur d'amélioration des pratiques, et puis évidemment comme rémunération. Et tout ça nous amène, me semble-t-il, à être assez optimiste. Alors, optimiste ne veut pas dire non plus complètement naïf, hein. Ce sera aussi un enjeu de captation de valeur pour le monde agricole, et on voit bien tout un tas d'acteurs qui aujourd'hui s'engagent. Moi, je voudrais m'assurer que ceux qui vont produire les efforts, hein, ceux qui travaillent le sol, ceux qui sont finalement les acteurs primordiaux, eh bien, le juste retour de valeur ajoutée, que ce ne soit pas simplement des plateformes ou des grands fonds qui utilisent à des fins strictement personnelles en captant une partie de la valeur du travail qui est fait par les agriculteurs. Voilà. Donc, un très grand merci à nos panélistes pour ce webinaire. Merci Jean-Christophe d'avoir été le grand ordonnateur. Merci à nos traducteurs qui, au bout de 2 heures, doivent être maintenant contents que ce webinaire se termine. Et puis, j'en profite pour souligner la qualité des webinaires qu'organise Pluriagri. Et puis, je laisse le dernier mot à Jean-Christophe. Merci à tous. On ne vous entend pas, Jean-Christophe. Il doit y avoir le micro qui est coupé.
Excusez-moi. Merci effectivement à tous nos intervenants. Je pense effectivement la discussion était très intéressante, et j'espère qu'on va pouvoir continuer à échanger. Et on a effectivement des défis à relever qui sont tout à fait communs. L'agriculture représente à peu près 10% des émissions des gaz à effet de serre aux États-Unis comme en Europe. C'est un petit peu plus en France, je crois, 15-17%. Enfin, qu'on voit qu'on est dans des situations au-delà de nos différences, effectivement, historiques, sociales, politiques, etc. Il y a vraiment des défis en commun à relever. Je pense qu'on essaye, en tout cas, avec ce type de webinaire, d'y contribuer. Merci encore et à bientôt.